Scott Kisbaugh is already here. Get you turned on there, Scott. Scott Kisbaugh is chief of the Lake Monitoring and Assessment Program at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I've known Scott for years. Back in the 70s and 80s, we were working on the Citizen Statewide Lake Assessment Program, New York State CSLAP, and Scott was the go-to guy for lake eutrophication and data sets at the state level. Then he still is. He's the guy that has to put all of this data together lake by lake for the state and come up with summary statements about the condition of the lakes. And so we thought it'd be incredibly valuable to have his perspective from a state level. And also, as I think many are aware, and that Scott will be detailing, there was a citizen surveillance program designed by DEC, Dr. Rebecca Gorney, and as a result, 30 or so of the Owasco watershed lake members were trained to gather samples in ways that were required by the state so that we would have certifiable results, and that training occurred. The data was captured over the summer, and it is the data that both John and Dave Matthews have referred to. So now I think we're going to get a closer look at that data perhaps and how it looks in relation to similar efforts in other lakes. Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. Bob just gave half my talk, and Dave and John gave you the other half, so I can get you to break really quickly. What I will talk about over the next 20 minutes or so is the state's harmful algal bloom program, and specifically the program as we developed it on Owasco Lake. So you've seen variations of this before, and I won't belabor the point. I will start by saying a speaker should never contradict himself in his first slide, but I'm going to do that by saying that when we talk about harmful algal blooms, we're not really talking about algae. You've heard that already. We're talking about cyanobacteria. But I want to emphasize a couple of the key points associated with this slide is that when we use the term harmful algal bloom, each component of that term is critically important. So we talked about the middle part of the term, the algae, that we're really talking about cyanobacteria. The second part that I think is really important to emphasize is the bloom part of it. We're concerned about cyanobacteria not because of the presence of cyanobacteria, as was indicated by, I think, both of the previous speakers. We see cyanobacteria in almost every lake in the state. What we're concerned about is when cyanobacteria grows to the extent that it forms a bloom. And a little later, I'll define from DEC's perspective what we mean by a bloom. But keep in mind that if you happen to hear cyanobacteria is in your lake, that's not necessarily an alarming thing. It's an alarming thing when you have a bloom of cyanobacteria. And that alarm occurs because of the first part of the term. The H in harmful algal blooms refers to harmful, that these blooms can produce cyanotoxins. Dave talked about them a little bit, but it's also worth noting that the blooms can also produce other substances, other material that can create dermal reactions or otherwise can create some health problems. So even if your bloom does not have high levels of toxins, the fact that it's a cyanobacteria bloom represents a risk. That's a little less relevant for Owasco Lake, as you'll see, it has pretty toxic blooms. But in those instances in which we actually don't see evidence of high levels of toxins, that's still an area of concern. This problem is not new, certainly to Owasco Lake, but in the larger sense, it is not new to lakes in New York State over the last year or two or three, the time frame in which you've been hearing about it. If you look at the writings of Samuel Champlain or others talking about Oneida Lake 400 years ago, they use a rather charming term, lake blossoms, to describe what we would now call a harmful algal bloom. I'm not suggesting that we change the term harmful algal bloom to lake blossoms, but recognize that we've probably been seeing these things for a long time. Really over the last decade, when you see pictures behind me in Lake Ontario and Lake Champlain and Lake Erie, these things have been occurring for a while. So for years, I think there was the expectation that this was a large lake phenomenon. Not so much over the last decade when we've seen lakes all throughout New York State, from as far west as you can get in New York State to Long Island to even portions of the Adirondacks, where we're seeing smaller lakes that are exhibiting these harmful algal blooms. So New York DEC, working with the health department, working with other organizations, started to document this. In 2013, the National Wildlife Federation did a survey of all of the states and asked them, what do you know about this issue? How widespread are harmful algal blooms in your state? The state with the second most blooms at that time was Kansas, which reported 14 of them. New York documented 50 at that time. So the initial reaction was, oh my God, this is a much more significant problem in New York. Maybe New York to some extent is a perfect storm, large number of lakes, heavy use of the lakes, and a wide variety of lake types, from very small ponds to very large lakes. So we certainly have opportunities for more blooms, but what we were really seeing is a robust monitoring program that was doing a good job of documenting these blooms. By 2015, as you can see on the bottom of this bottom of this slide, the US EPA did surveys of all of the states, or specifically the EPA regions, the 10 EPA regions around the country, and found that the majority of places where we saw large numbers of blooms was in the Northeast, and specifically in New York State. So DEC built a harmful algal bloom program around this phenomenon to try to document and understand more about why these blooms were occurring. The key focus of that program is the middle of this wheel, harmful algal bloom surveillance. And what I mean by surveillance is visual inspections of lakes. So what we'll be describing is the program that's been set up in New York State, and specifically the program that's been set up in Owasco Lake. So surveillance, and the sister of surveillance, if we will, monitoring, is the visual inspection for blooms, collecting samples to document blooms. And so you can think of the 3 Ps of this surveillance and monitoring program. The first is programs. We have really 3 programs in New York State that are actively documenting blooms. The first is, as Bob referenced, the Citizen Statewide Lake Assessment Program, which I've been running not since the 70s, I'm not that old, but since the 80s, I'm almost that old. So there are about 125 lakes in New York State that are sampled as part of the Citizen Statewide Lake Assessment Program, and there's a very active harmful algal bloom monitoring component of that program. The second is our in-house lake monitoring program called the LCI, the Lake Classification and Inventory Survey, in which we rotate into different lakes all around the state each year and do monitoring and document blooms. And the third, and it's important to keep this in mind, is the State Health Department has very strong responsibilities for documenting blooms through their beach surveillance program. So that's one component of it, programs. Second is partnerships. New York State Federation of Lake Associations is our partner in the Citizen Statewide Lake Assessment Program. We partner, as I mentioned, with multiple agencies, particularly the State Health Department and State Parks and Recreation, to try to better understand what's going on with blooms. There's academic monitoring that's going on, and specifically academic analysis of samples. SUNY ESF and SUNY Stony Brook analyze the majority of samples collected in our program. And then where Owasco fits in is this partnership setup that we have with many of the large lakes, particularly in the Finger Lakes region. So again, I'll talk about that more. The third component, which is critically important, the third P, is public. We need eyes of the public, people on the ground, to tell us where blooms are occurring. And the reason we need that is there are 16,000 lakes and ponds in New York State. The Lake Services section, which is 4 people in DEC, simply not enough people to go out and look for blooms. So this partnership, the 3 Ps, are critical. So we get these harmful algal bloom reports that come in from the 3 Ps, programs, partnerships, public. First thing that we do is characterize that. Is that a credible report? There are blooms that are occurring all around lakes in New York State. Many of those blooms, as John pointed out, including those in Owasco Lake, might not necessarily be blue-green algae blooms or cyanobacteria blooms. So the first thing we need to do is to determine, is it a credible harmful algal bloom report? If it is, DEC characterizes that as a suspicious bloom. Then sampling results determine whether or not we can confirm that in fact that is a cyanobacteria bloom based on metrics, chlorophyll A measurements from the device that John described earlier, a fluoroprobe that can evaluate the level of blue-green algae in a sample. And then we also look to see what the toxin levels are. If toxin levels exceed the World Health Organization threshold for a high-risk bloom, we call that a high toxin bloom. So the visual assessments is based largely on, do we see appearances of what we characterize as a blue-green algae bloom? Spilt paint, pea soup, green streaks, green dots in the water. If we see any of those things that's typical of a cyanobacteria bloom, we characterize that as suspicious. We also need to know, are there bloom quantities of it? Those are things that we measure, but we also look for the kind of pictures that were shown earlier. Do those things look like dense concentrations of cyanobacteria? And if they do, then we'll characterize that as a suspicious bloom. We also use monitoring data, again, to help determine whether or not we can document, validate that bloom, and confirm that, in fact, that this is a cyanobacteria bloom, which includes both laboratory measurements and microscopy. Regardless of whether or not there are toxins in that bloom, regardless of whether or not we have a sample, the messaging is consistent from both the EC and the health department. Avoid it. Try to avoid exposure to those blooms. Try to make sure that you keep pets and your family away from it. If you're exposed to those blooms, seek medical assistance as soon as you can if you need it. Particularly if you experience any of the symptoms that are consistent with blue-green algae exposure, nausea, vomiting, rashes, and so on. And then finally, we want you to report that information to the local health department so that they can document whether or not the blooms that you think you've been exposed to are in fact being reported by other people. So several of the speakers, both John and Dave, mentioned the importance of location, location, location. Blooms can occur anywhere on the water body, but particularly what they do is concentrate on the shoreline. So the images that you see on the left of this picture come from the World Health Organization, and they sort of summarize the way a bloom is formed. You get algae that's found within the water column. Because of the buoyancy that Dave talked about, they move up to the surface. Then the wind can push them along to the shoreline. When you see all those phenomena occur, you can substantially concentrate that bloom, and you can concentrate the toxins associated with the bloom. So I mentioned in our volunteer lake monitoring program, we've been sampling for a number of years. 3,500 samples over a 5-year period of time found that open water blooms are very uncommon. And even when you do see open water blooms, the likelihood of getting high toxins in those blooms is even lower. Along the shoreline is a whole different story. That's when you see the heavily concentrated blooms and the high toxicity associated with those blooms. So DEC pulls all that information together, suspicious blooms, and confirmed with high toxin blooms. And every Friday, we do a public website notification. So the map that you see on the slide is pretty typical of what we produce on our webpage every Friday from mid-May till the end of October. The map shows documentation of where we have credible evidence of blooms, the characterization of that bloom. Is it suspicious? Is it confirmed? Is it confirmed with high toxins? And an associated table that indicates the name of the water body and the information base that used to support that listing. So for those who go to our webpage every Friday, you'll see this listing, an indication of where we know, where we have evidence of blooms. So if you look at that accumulation of listing going back to, is this a new phenomenon in New York, or is this restricted to just Owasco Lake? Clearly the answer to that question is no. If you look at a 5-year period of time, we've documented harmful algal blooms on nearly 300 water bodies in New York State. And if you look at the map on the left and the arrow showing Owasco Lake, you can see it's not even a phenomenon that's unique to lakes in this particular area. So one of the questions that you may be asking is this problem getting worse? The graph on the upper right shows the cumulative number of notification listings, number of water bodies that have harmful algal blooms from 2012 to 2016. Green represents 2012, blue represents 2016. So that map seems to show that the blooms are getting worse, that we're seeing an increasing number of them. But if you look at the graph on the lower left, what that shows is we're actually doing a lot more monitoring. And the percentage of water bodies that actually have documented blooms really hasn't changed that much. So we don't know whether or not the phenomenon is getting worse. We're doing a better job of documenting it. Furthermore, if you look at just a subset of the lakes that have been monitored every year for the last 5 years, we saw from 2012 to 2015 a pretty steady increase in the number of lakes that were documenting harmful algal blooms, but a big drop in 2016. So that may be reflecting what John was pointing out earlier, a drought year. We may actually have been seeing fewer lakes in 2016 with blooms because of the less water being in this, less water coming into the system, less runoff coming into the system. Not much consolation for Owasco Lake, which obviously had problems despite the drought conditions. So that certainly is one of the troubling signs. It may be that there's a relationship between the amount of precipitation that's occurring and the frequency of blooms. It may be that the phenomenon is not getting much worse, but there's still some problems. First is 174 lakes and ponds last year that had blooms. That's not a good number. Second is that for the first time, we were really documenting blooms in rivers. Wallkill River, Seneca River, Oneida River all had documented harmful algal blooms last year, all of them for the first time. Dog deaths, as was mentioned by a couple of other speakers, nerve toxins can be produced by these blooms, and that's of particular concern for dogs because dogs will go in the water, they'll accumulate fur in their skin, and then they'll lick it off. That represents a concentrated dose of nerve toxins. So there have been a number of dog deaths that we believe might be associated with cyanobacteria blooms. And then the fourth and the fifth are really the focus of the conversations here. For the first time, drinking water really was brought into the conversation because of the problems that occurred in Owasco Lake. And you'll hear more about that from a speaker a little bit later, but I'll touch on it at least briefly. And then bottom line is we still don't really know why these blooms are occurring. So let's start talking about Owasco Lake. Since we started looking in 2012, we've been documenting blooms. We've been documenting more blooms each year, and that could be because we've been looking more, or it could be because the problem is getting worse. If you look at that period of time from 2012 to 2015, you see that the number of blooms that we've documented has increased. The levels of blue-green algae in those blooms have increased, but the toxin levels are not necessarily increasing. They're bouncing around from one year to another. And if you look at the map on the upper left, you'll see that the blooms have largely been concentrated in the north end, but they're not unique to the north end. We are seeing them, including high toxin blooms at multiple locations along the lake. So, what both of the previous speakers referenced was the development of this surveillance plan. Working directly with Tim Schneider from the Owasco Lake Watershed Inspection Program and a number of other partners, DEC and these partners developed this Shoreline Harmful Algal Bloom program. That program involves trained volunteers who go out and look for blooms. When there appears to be evidence of a bloom, we'll collect a sample in association with that bloom and send it in to SUNY ESF for analysis. That program was really formalized in 2016 through a formal surveillance program in which we established 24 zones along the lake. The map, again on the lower left, shows in green the areas that were surveyed every week by the Owasco Watershed Lake Association volunteers that were part of the surveillance network. And they collected a total of 235 surveillance reports and 36 bloom samples. And so those represented the times that they were looking and the times that they think they found evidence of a bloom. So this shows a timeline of starting at the end of July, going through early October, when blooms were found. And if I can get this to work, what we'll show is a map that was generated by Tim that shows the timeline in which blooms occurred. What you're going to be seeing is a chronology of when blooms were showing up on the lake So I'll let you watch this for a minute. So that was the chronology of the blooms in 2016. If you summarize the results from the last 2 years of monitoring, 2015 and 2016, you can see the two tables that are listed here. And a couple things jump out for those that can see it. First is that we did more sampling as the summer went on because there seemed to be more evidence of blooms. As the summer went on, the extent of the blooms themselves, the thickness, if you will, of the blooms also increased, so the blue-green algae content was higher, for the most part, later in the summer than early in the summer, and the toxin levels increased from early in the summer to late in the summer. So you may also be looking at the table and say, what looked worse, 2015 or 2016? Which had higher toxin levels, which had higher blue-green algae levels? So plotting that information out, what this plot shows is 2013 through 2016, the average blue-green algae content and the average toxin levels as represented by microcystin, the liver toxin that is the basis for most of the high toxin notification program by DEC. So if you look at the orange columns, you can see a steady increase from 2013 to 2016, indicating that blue-green algae content appeared to increase in the blooms. Likewise, if you look at the gray columns, which corresponds to the toxin levels, that also appeared to increase from 2013 to 2016. However, those are average measurements, and as you saw from the previous table, there's some really high numbers in that mix, which will significantly change the way the average value is calculated. If you look at the median value, which could be the most representative value in those, we did see an increase from 2013 to 2014 to 2015, and while that was also the case with blue-green algae content, meaning in 2016 that also increased, toxin levels as a median measurement were actually pretty similar from 2015 to 2016. So one could say the numbers stabilized. One could also say that they're still really high and much too high, and that's what I would say, they're much too high. So one of the other questions is this phenomenon unique to the Finger Lakes? We showed the statewide map earlier that showed 285 locations over the last 5 years where we've documented blooms. What about in our own backyard here? What about the lakes that are most similar to Owasco Lake, the other Finger Lakes? So this table shows the 6 Finger Lakes in which we've documented blooms over the last 3 years. And if you look at Owasco Lake, which is the 5th line down, you'll see that the bloom duration was a little longer than most of the other lakes. They started a little earlier, they ended a little bit later for the most part. The blue-green algae content was a little higher than in most, but in not all of the lakes, and the toxin levels were substantially higher. There's a couple of other things that sort of jump out at this. The Canisius Lake results show that when they had a bloom, they would have extremely high blue-green algae levels, but we did not measure toxins in any of those. Likewise, there were some other lakes that had much smaller blue-green algae content, but pretty high toxin levels. So there isn't a very clear relationship in the Finger Lake region between blue-green algae content and toxin levels. There does seem to be in Owasco Lake, however. As blue-green algae levels increase, toxin levels appear to increase. So again, all of this information collected by Tim and his partners through the Owasco Watershed Lake Association ultimately resulted in reports that are generated to DEC, samples that go to SUNY ESF. All of this information behind me is really the summary of what the outreach program looks like, but I can summarize it pretty quickly. Information from Tim gets to DEC. It immediately gets sent out to a larger group of people, including county government, state government from both DEC and the health department, and a number of other local partners. and that information gets communicated extremely quickly. That information is also uploaded to the AWLA webpage. It's also uploaded to the Owasco Lake Watershed Inspection Program webpage and to the DEC webpage. So there's lots of outreach. County Health Department also supports outreach from a number of different perspectives, including press releases whenever reports come out. So one of the other reasons that we're here is not just talking about blooms, but talking about blooms as it relates to drinking water. Again, there's going to be a lot more discussion about this a little bit later, but I can summarize sort of the key talking points. We first documented shoreline blooms in Owasco Lake in late July. Fairly quickly, toxin levels were at a pretty high level. But at that time, there really wasn't evidence of blooms out in the open water or anywhere near where the water intake is. However, later in the summer, we started seeing low but measurable toxin levels in the treated drinking water. And again, you're going to be hearing a lot more about this. This represents, as far as we know, the first instances in which there have been drinking water detectable hits. But again, I want to emphasize that all of those numbers were below EPA's health advisory thresholds. So one of the other lingering questions that both John and Dave alluded to is why. So what this plot shows is the relationship in New York State lakes between the likelihood of a bloom occurrence and phosphorus concentrations in the lake. And there are a couple of different ways you can define blooms. You can define it visually. Was there visual evidence of spilt paint, pea soup, green streaks, green dots in the water? Or can we document it numerically, a sample that is above some chlorophyll threshold? Regardless of how you define a bloom, you can see this plot shows a clear relationship between phosphorus and bloom formation. The higher the phosphorus concentrations, the more likely it is you're going to get a shoreline bloom. So this is pretty consistent with a long-standing mantra of lake management, which is if you can reduce phosphorus concentrations, you can reduce the likelihood of lots of lake ills, one of which is cyanobacteria blooms. But you can see that there are some lakes that should not, under most traditional ways of evaluating bloom susceptibility, they should not be getting blooms. Owasco Lake is one of them. Typically, once you get phosphorus concentrations above about 20 micrograms per liter or parts per billion, you increase the likelihood of a bloom forming. Yet Owasco Lake has been consistently below that. In 2015, Canandaigua Lake had a very large bloom at the north end of the lake, and that lake has even lower phosphorus concentrations. Lake Placid, which has even lower phosphorus concentrations than that, had a small bloom in 2014. And there are some lakes that have very high phosphorus concentrations that don't get cyanobacteria blooms. So it's complicated. Hence the reason for all of the detailed study, the detailed evaluation. So we have an enormous data set that we've been gathering over the last couple of years. And in a separate project we're doing with Upstate Freshwater Institute and SUNY ESF and others, we're digging deeply into that data to say, what are the clues? What's going on here? So I think Owasco Lake will benefit from that work, but Owasco Lake will especially benefit from the very targeted evaluation and study that's going on that, again, Dave described. So it leaves many unanswered questions. Dave talked about a few of these, gave some suggestions for some answers for some of them, but we don't have answers to a lot of these on a statewide basis, and we don't have it for some specific water bodies like Owasco Lake. So Dave talked a little bit about the second of these. Where are they born? Are these open water blooms? Are they shoreline blooms? Are they a combination of those? That's a fundamentally important question from a management perspective, because that dictates to what extent, locationally and quantity-wise, you have to manage nutrient inputs. If in fact nutrient is the first question, the trigger of these blooms. We think they are, but what is it, phosphorus or nitrogen? What role do each of those play? That's particularly important. What's the source of those nutrients? Is it septics? Is it atmospheric? Is it waterfowl? Is it agriculture? Is it the bottom of the lake? Is it all of those things? In the case of Owasco Lake, has this lake passed a tipping point? Are we now going to regularly experience the kind of blooms that you didn't see in this lake 5 years ago? We don't know the answer to that, but we hope we can find the answer to that. And bottom line, how do you deal with these? Short term, what things need to be done now, and long term, what things need to be done in the future. So as Bob mentioned, this is just a very brief summary of the harmful algal bloom program on a state level and specifically here at Owasco Lake. If you have any more questions, here's the contact information, including the contact information for the DEC HAB coordinator, Rebecca Gorney.